Joining me now from Adelaide is the Health Minister, Mark Butler. Mark Butler, thanks for your time. And I might start here in terms of the Trump presidency on your old portfolio in opposition of climate change and energy, given that report. Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement, doesn't that turn the world on its head in terms of climate change, net zero, all those sorts of targets, renewable energy? How do you see it playing out?
Well, we've seen this before with the former Trump administration taking a very different approach to climate change to his predecessors than the Obama administration. We also know, and I think the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Wong have said this was a change election, and former President Trump ran on a change platform, so we shouldn't be surprised if there is very significant policy change both within the US but on the global stage as well. This won't come as a surprise to my colleague, Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen, or to his colleagues around the world, but it won't stop the global investment shift, which is very much in the direction of net zero technology, whether that's in energy or in vehicles. We'll continue our case for global investment to come to Australia because we have some of the best solar resources on the planet, some of the best wind resources on the planet, and some of the best scientists as well. So, you know, perhaps there's an upside for us in terms of the investment shifting a bit more away from the US than it has under Joe Biden's term.
Will the government be doing a 2035 target before the election, do you think?
Well, that's not a matter for the Health Minister. We'll take the usual sort of very much evidence-based approach to that question, Andrew. As you know, that's a matter for the Prime Minister and Minister Bowen. We've got a legislated target of net zero emissions by 2050. We'll take a proper approach, consulting with industry, with other stakeholders, and receiving the best available scientific advice to comply with our international obligations to set a 2035 target, but more importantly, to make sure that we're able to continue to really take the enormous investment opportunities and job opportunities that come from the global shift to zero emissions.
I mentioned that first Albanese-Trump phone call and the President's exclamation on that call, "We're going to be perfect friends." Should Australia and its government take heart from that conversation?
Well, we've been such close friends for decades and decades, particularly since the early 1940s. We've fought alongside each other. We've shared very common values and promoted them right across the world. We share very deep cultural and personal ties. There's no closer friend that we have than the United States. So that's a friendship and an alliance and a relationship that's transcended different personalities and different political parties. So we very much firmly expect that to continue over the next 4 years as well.
What work has gone on behind the scenes to ensure the government can transition to a Trump administration?
Well, there's been very, very detailed work, particularly in the relevant portfolios. You'd understand, Andrew, the economic portfolio, defence and foreign affairs. Very deep engagement, as you would always expect across the political spectrum. That's been a long-standing feature of our relationship with the US. It goes both ways. The Americans engage with the government and the opposition of the time at the time here in Australia, and we do the same overseas. A particular focus of that engagement, as you know, Andrew, has been around the AUKUS project. We were particularly pleased to see the supporting legislation pass through the Congress with the support of significant Republicans. Mike Pompeo, for example, has been a focus of that engagement and was a very strong supporter of the AUKUS program. So you wouldn't be surprised that, of course, we've been engaging with both sides of politics in the lead into the election to make sure that Australia's interests were safeguarded no matter the outcome.
Does the government have any fears around what will happen in terms of Ukraine and Taiwan from this change of US administration?
Well, look, that's not really a matter I'm heavily focused on as the Health Minister. You know, that really remains to be seen whether there is any US administration change in relation to any of those global hotspots. I mean, I think we're all conscious of the fact that the world right now is a more dangerous more conflicted place than perhaps it was 4 and 8 years ago, unfortunately, because of the land war in Europe that we thought we'd never see again, and the devastating conflict in the Middle East. And of course, there are ongoing tensions in our own region in the Asia Pacific. So we'll be working very, very closely with the US and with other like-minded countries and allies, always with an eye to promoting and protecting Australia's national interests.
And do you expect Donald Trump to put a 10% tariff on our exports to the US, and how will that affect our economy?
Well, our trade relationship is a little different with the US. I think the US has a trade surplus with Australia, so there's not that same interest that perhaps former President Trump is articulating around the very big trade deficit they have with China when it comes to Australia. We will, as I said, be out there promoting and protecting Australia's national interests. I think probably the greater concern that we have about any impact of that sort of change on Australia's economic interests is a more indirect impact about what it might do to global growth, to slow global growth even further, potentially to lift inflationary pressures in the global economy that would have more a knock-on effect on Australia rather than a direct change to the US-Australia trading arrangements.
And what about domestically? There's a spring in the step of Liberals here after the result. Do you see how cost of living hurt the Democrats, the issues of inflation and immigration? Could they also see you lose office?
Well, we don't take any election for granted, and we know that particularly right now it's a very difficult time for incumbent governments because it's a really difficult time for households right around the world. You're seeing that election after election. Households expressing a very clear view that they want their governments focused on them. They want their governments doing everything they responsibly can to help them through this cost of living crisis that really we haven't seen of this type for more than 30 years, Andrew. And I think that has been our focus since we were elected. Every single budget from the early budget we put in place in October 2022 has been so squarely focused on making sure we do everything we responsibly can to help households with their cost of living pressures while not adding to inflationary pressures as well. Now, I'm not a US commentator, but if you do take a lesson from the US election last week, it is the same lesson we take from other elections we've seen over the last 12 or 24 months, and that is voters want to see their governments focused overwhelmingly on costs of living.
I wanted to ask now about this situation involving the Shadow Transport Minister, Bridget McKenzie, being forced to declare 16 flight upgrades she didn't previously declare. Now, she's issued an apology, but Peter Dutton and David Littleproud are not going to take action against her. Should she stay a Shadow Minister?
Look, ultimately that's a matter for Mr Dutton and Mr Littleproud and for Ms McKenzie herself. I mean, I think I make the point that she was the chief prosecutor in this sort of saga over the last couple of weeks, and yet was obviously pretty casual about the way in which she declared her own upgrades. It's really important that as politicians we are completely transparent about any gifts, any hospitality that we receive in the course of our work as members of Parliament, that we declare that transparently and in real time. That's available online. People can go and see what I've received, what other members of Parliament have received over the last sort of several years, going back many, many years if they want to. And so the fact that someone in such an important position has not declared that, not just once or twice, but on many, many occasions, particularly given she's in the transport portfolio, is obviously pretty concerning. But ultimately it's a matter for that side of politics to deal with that.
Speaking of which, I see in July 2023 you received an upgrade to business on a personal trip with Qantas. Can you tell us who you approached for that, where that trip was to, and how that occurred?
Well, to the best of my recollection, I was in Melbourne for a colleague's 50th birthday on the weekend. Obviously, I'd paid for my flight. It was a quick go over on Saturday afternoon, come back on Sunday morning. I'd booked myself, and to the best of my recollection, I simply sort of got to the airport and they had upgraded me. I mean, this happens by airlines to shift the load in their airline. If they have a spare business class seat, generally they'll upgrade an economy class passenger up to that so that they can then on-sell the economy class seat, for which there's always more demand than there is capacity. So I didn't ask anyone for it. I simply arrived at the airport and got handed a ticket that was an upgrade. I declared it in the proper way, and this is not uncommon.
Now, COVID is kind of in the distant memory now, but you've announced today that Australian mums and newborns will have free access to the best vaccine to prevent the RSV virus ahead of winter 2025. What's behind this move?
Well, you mentioned COVID. COVID was overwhelmingly an illness that afflicted older Australians. RSV is overwhelmingly an illness that hits the youngest members of our community. So this year, for example, we've seen about 160,000 cases of RSV recorded over the course of this winter. Fully half of them were under 4-year-olds. It really hits under 2-year-olds very, very hard. It's the leading cause of hospitalisation for babies. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be able to announce one of the world's most comprehensive vaccination and protection programs for Australia's babies. We think about 12,000 babies are hospitalised every year, every winter through RSV. The leading cause, as I said, of hospitalisation, about a quarter of them end up in ICU. This program I'm announcing today, we think, will cut that hospitalisation rate by up to 90%, a huge win for families and for babies.
I wanted to ask about this COVID inquiry the other week. A lot of people were a bit underwhelmed by this, that the states weren't put under the blowtorch a bit more, and the chief recommendation seemed to be a Labor election promise in 2022, a Centre for Disease Control. Shouldn't that be pretty much up and running by now?
Well, we waited to hear the lessons and the recommendations of the COVID inquiry before finalising our design of the Centre of Disease Control. But I think you need to look deeper into this report, Andrew. It really is a very comprehensive, measured, sensible report that does examine a range of the decisions that state governments were taking. Right through the report in particular, there is very detailed commentary about the mental health impacts and broader impacts on children and younger Australians of a range of decisions that were taken around school closures, around who could attend playgrounds and so much more besides. So this commentary that they didn't think about the decisions taken by state governments just doesn't bear out a reading of the inquiry report. It doesn't pull its punches at all. And I think the most important thing of a range of findings I think that it makes, the most important one is that here in Australia we didn't shift at the time we should from essentially a precautionary approach, which was appropriate in the first few months of the pandemic, to a more evidence-based approach to decision-making, an approach that balanced the benefits and the risks associated with a particular decision, and also took account of those non-COVID risks, as I said, particularly mental health impacts, given the scale of the decision-making on people's freedoms and ability to go about their usual lives. And that was, I think, a very profound finding of the inquiry, which then went on to say that the lack of that shift and the lack of transparency around decision-making has led to a very serious erosion of trust among the community, which means that if a pandemic like COVID happened again next week, that we would be unlikely to get the sort of cooperation from the community that we had to things like lockdowns and school closures that was so central to our pandemic response.